Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a quiet August day in 1915, right in the crucible of a global conflict. His Majesty's government makes a seemingly modest appeal to its citizens. Please, use paper money instead of gold coins. Sounds almost quaint, doesn't it? A simple request during wartime. But what if that seemingly small favor was, in fact, the very first tremor in an earthquake that would dismantle a monetary system centuries in the making? What if it was the quiet, almost imperceptible beginning of a revolution, or perhaps the grandest economic experiment ever conceived? One that would fundamentally reshape not just finance, but, the very fabric of human civilization.
It's truly fascinating, isn't it? What our source brings to light is that this wasn't a sudden, deliberate design, meticulously planned with a white paper and technical specs like, say, the creation of Bitcoin. Instead, the fiat system, as we know it today, it evolved through a complex, often messy process of political compromise and sheer expediency. Our deep dive today is dedicated to truly understanding the operational structure of the system, how it functions in reality, far beyond any romanticized notions. We'll explore why it has persisted for over a century, despite what many might perceive as its obvious flaws, and how it has profoundly impacted nearly every aspect of our lives.
And when we say every aspect, we really mean it. You might be asking yourself, what could my money possibly have to do with the quality of the food I eat, or the buildings I walk past every day, maybe even how scientific research is conducted? Well, prepare to uncover some surprising and deeply interconnected insights. Our mission is to connect these seemingly disparate dots, revealing how the very nature of our money has influenced everything from your diet and the architecture around you to the science you've been taught to trust, and even the fuels that power our modern world. It's a journey that could fundamentally shift how you view the world around you. Let's begin at the genesis of this quiet revolution, what our source aptly terms the unannounced revolution. Our story unfolds with the British experiment, stretching from 1915 all the way through to 1971. The initial spark was that seemingly innocuous August 6, 1915 announcement from the British Treasury. It wasn't a decree, but a polite request. Public departments were asked to prioritize notes over gold coins, and citizens were earnestly encouraged to pay gold into post offices and banks, to request payment of checks and notes, and generally to use notes for their daily transactions. On the surface, it might have seemed minor, a wartime measure. But, as the source clarifies, this was the Bank of England's subtle, yet profound initiation of a move away from the long-standing gold standard.
And that subtle initiation is where the contrast with a system like Bitcoin couldn't be more striking. Think about Satoshi Nakamoto's precise launch, complete with a comprehensive white paper outlining every technical specification, every rule, every incentive. His Majesty's government offered no such foundational document for fiat money. Their approach relied heavily on an appeal to authority and, quite frankly, emotional manipulation, all cloaked in the guise of national interest. What's critical to grasp is that this wasn't an entirely new concept for the Bank of England. Even before 1915, they had been operating a kind of gold exchange standard with their colonies. They effectively offered their currency as a reserve currency to these dependencies, allowing them to maintain a certain inflationary margin. By 1913, their official gold reserves were barely a third of their total liabilities to foreign monetary authorities.
Wow, only a third.
Yeah. This meant they were effectively exporting inflation to the colonies and beyond, but it also placed them in an increasingly precarious liquidity position, vulnerable if too many parties demanded actual gold redemption. It was a house of cards, really, and the war simply presented the convenient justification to shift with the rules.
So it wasn't a singular, abrupt break, but a slow, almost imperceptible creep. The source highlights how, over the following year, the British public gradually became more accustomed to the use of paper money and more reconciled to the absence of gold. Unquote. It was a conditioning process, subtle but effective. Then, in December 1919, the Treasury ratcheted up the pressure, requesting that private bankers surrender their gold coins to the state. And the numbers speak volumes. By June 1920, private bankers had seeded over 41 million pounds in gold coins in exchange for paper notes, a process that cost the government a mere 5,516 times to facilitate. It's quite telling, isn't it, that our source repeatedly emphasizes the conspicuous absence of any proof-of-work mining at fiat's genesis, unlike Bitcoin's inherent and transparent design. There was no costly energy expenditure to secure the system, just appeals and quiet confiscations.
Exactly, and this shift was exacerbated by Britain's profound struggles in the aftermath of World War I. They found themselves in a bind, grappling with immense government spending, intense union wage demands, the political imperative to maintain the pre-war gold peg for sterling, a symbol of their global financial standing, and the enduring pressure to retain their role as the global reserve currency. This precarious balancing act forced them into what the source describes as financial and political engineering, instead of pursuing the economically necessary, albeit politically painful, devaluation of the currency. To regain international competitiveness, British prices needed to fall by maybe 10–20%. However, powerful labor unions fiercely resisted wage cuts, leading to chronic unemployment. The Bank of England, having discovered the seductive power of this paper alchemy, believed it could politically maneuver its way out of its gold redemption obligations, effectively choosing political stability over economic solvency.
Political stability over solvency. That's a recurring theme, it seems. This national predicament eventually spilled onto the international stage, leading to attempts to restore some semblance of global monetary order. The Genoa Conference in 1922 was a prime example. The conference famously declared, and I quote, "Gold is the only common standard which all European countries could at present agree to adopt." Yet because the Bank of England still hadn't fully resumed gold redemption, they essentially formalized a global gold exchange standard, a system mirroring Britain's previous colonial model. Under this new arrangement, the US dollar became redeemable for gold, but only by other central banks, not by individual citizens.
Right, and that's a striking irony, as this very system had, in essence, placed Britain in that precarious liquidity position before the war. The seeds of future instability were sown right then and there.
So stepping back, what this tells us is that the narrative of fiat's spontaneous evolution, driven by political expediency and immediate compromise, rather than a conscious grand design based on sound economic principles, well, it helps us understand many of the inherent contradictions and instabilities we observe in the system today. It wasn't about building the most robust or logical system. It was about patching problems as they arose, always prioritizing political and immediate financial pressures over long-term economic soundness.
Precisely. And then the center of gravity in this monetary shift passed across the Atlantic, ushering in the American embrace, spanning from 1934 to 1971. President Roosevelt's 1934 order to confiscate Americans' gold, effectively buying it at $20.67 per troy ounce, was an absolutely pivotal moment. Our source argues, quite controversially, that this act, combined with endless government fiat, not only extended the Great Depression, but also paved the way for the rise of a bureaucratic monster that fed relentlessly off inflation. It was complete centralization of the monetary base.
A bureaucratic monster feeding off inflation. Quite the image. And this emerging monetary reality was formally codified with the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1946. This landmark agreement cemented the US dollar as the new global reserve currency. Crucially, it remained redeemable for gold, but once again, this convertibility was strictly limited to other central banks, not to individual citizens. It was, in essence, a global replication of the colonial gold exchange standard that Britain had previously employed, but on a much larger scale, solidifying the dollar's global dominance.
Yes, but even this system, built on a foundation of indirect gold convertibility, eventually faced its inevitable reckoning. By the late 1960s, European central banks, growing increasingly concerned about the purchasing power of their US dollar holdings, which were being inflated by American spending, began aggressively redeeming those dollars for physical gold. This escalating pressure culminated in the famous, or perhaps infamous, Nixon shock on August 15, 1971.
The Nixon shock. And this is where the narrative takes a surprising turn. Nixon dramatically suspended the dollar's convertibility to gold, laying the blame squarely on speculators whom he accused of waging an all-out war on the American dollar. End quote. He famously reassured the nation, stating that the strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of its economy and that the American economy was by far the strongest in the world. He prognosticated with confidence that his actions would stabilize the dollar, promising that, and I quote, "Your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today."
Well, as we now know with the benefit of hindsight, Nixon's predictions were dramatic, almost comically, off the mark. Prices skyrocketed in the ensuing decades. The dollar's value plummeted. And this new system, completely unhinged from its golden anchor, transformed money trading into a lucrative, gargantuan industry. The source details how this wasn't just a temporary suspension, a blip on the radar. It was a fundamental, irreversible shift. Although the U.S. Treasury initially made some gestures towards maintaining a dollar-to-gold peg at some level, that sound money mirage utterly dissolved by 1973. It was at that precise point that the cost of living truly began its relentless and rapid climb, ushering in an entirely new economic era.
So if we summarize this century-long incremental installation process of the fiat standard, our source identifies some clear recurring hallmarks. We see gold confiscation, persistent and often rapid price rises. The imposition of price controls and futile attempts to stem the inflation, extensive central planning of the economy, relentless inflationary credit expansion, and those now familiar boom and bust cycles that punctuate our economic lives. The source also points to the constant aspiration by nations to export inflation by attempting to offload their fractionally backed currency onto foreign regimes, creating a global monetary game of hot potato.
Looking at this holistically, the narrative of a spontaneous evolution driven by political convenience and short-term compromise rather than a conscious grand design for economic stability powerfully explains many of the system's inherent contradictions we face today. It wasn't about constructing the most robust or economically logical system. Instead, it was about patching immediate problems as they arose, always leaning towards political expediency rather than foundational economic soundness, creating a system that fundamentally rewards debt and political influence.
Right. Now, how does this spawn of marriage between governments and banking, as the source vividly puts it, actually function on a fundamental level? Let's dive into fiat technology, where the very concept of debt transforms into money. The core engineering feature of fiat is this radical blurring of money and credit. It operates on the premise that future promises of payment are just as good as present, existing money, especially if these promises are issued or guaranteed by the government or licensed financial institution. To truly grasp this, consider the alternative. In the Bitcoin network, only coins that have already been mined and exist on the blockchain can settle transactions. With physical gold, only existing tangible gold can be used as payment. But with fiat, a mere promise of future payment can be immediately accepted as present-day value.
This is a truly critical distinction that sets fiat apart. Let's use a mortgage as a prime example. When a client secures a, say, $1 million loan to buy a house, the bank doesn't withdraw that money from existing cash reserves or from another depositor's balance. No, the bank simply creates those dollars at the exact moment the loan is issued. Their existence is entirely predicated on the borrower's future promise to repay that debt with interest. So the house buyer gets the present good, the seller receives present value in the form of these newly created fiat tokens, and the bank effectively mines new fiat money at virtually zero marginal cost. The underlying risk of default or systemic instability is ultimately borne by the central bank, which guarantees the commercial bank, the loan, and indeed the currency itself. Our source poses a fascinating question. Can such a system truly survive on the free market? In the immediate term, it appears incredibly favorable to all three parties involved, but it begs the question of long-term sustainability.
This fundamental blurring makes objective supply measurement and control incredibly challenging, if not impossible. The individual units of fiat are ephemeral, constantly being created when new loans are issued and destroyed when loans are repaid. This dynamic makes it virtually impossible to obtain an objective, agreed-upon measure of the true money supply. Contrast this with Bitcoin, where the total supply is auditable and mathematically verifiable with absolute precision, or gold, where the physical stock can be, in theory, accounted for. Furthermore, because the government ultimately backs the entire banking system, and the source argues that it must due to the nature of fiat, all credit issued by licensed financial entities is effectively government credit. This means that money of full maturity, existing, readily available, fully liquid money, is continuously blended with money that is not matured, which will only acquire its full liquid value in the future when debts are paid. It's a continuous opaque commingling.
This brings us to a crucial point. If we consider the core functions of central banks, we immediately identify inherent conflicts of interest. It's almost like asking a single entity to simultaneously be the scorekeeper, the team owner, and the star player all at once. The source makes a compelling argument that this commingling of roles is, in fact, the root cause of many of the economic crises that plague the modern world.
That's a powerful claim, and it brings us squarely to the network topography and central bank functions, particularly when viewed through the lens of centralization. Our source paints a picture of the global fiat network as remarkably centralized, with the U.S. Federal Reserve acting as what it calls the only full node. Scattered across the globe are approximately 200 other central banks, which function as interconnected nodes within this vast system.
And each of these central banks, from the smallest nation's monetary authority to the powerful Federal Reserve, performs four crucial and often inherently conflicting functions. Firstly, they wield a complete monopoly on providing their domestic fiat currency and on determining its supply and price. This means they dictate how much money is in circulation and what its cost of borrowing will be. Secondly, they hold a monopoly on clearing international payments, a vital role in global trade. Thirdly, they act as the sole authority for licensing and regulating domestic banks, holding their reserves, and clearing payments between them. They are the banking system's backbone. And finally, and perhaps most consequentially for governments, they serve as the main market maker for government bonds, effectively acting as the primary lender to the national government by continuously buying its debt.
What's truly remarkable is how these seemingly distinct functions are so deeply intertwined, creating what our source identifies as perverse incentives for the monopolists, incentives that inevitably lead to economic crises. Take, for instance, the clear conflict between maintaining the long-term value of the currency, which would be best served by a stable hard asset like gold, and the immediate need to settle international payments, which overwhelmingly relies on the U.S. dollar. This means central banks are constantly caught in a dilemma. Do they prioritize a monetary standard for future stability or for present international settlement and liquidity? They can't fully do both without compromise.
Exactly. This fundamental dilemma wouldn't even exist in a truly global, homogeneous monetary system, like a robust gold standard, which would offer consistent liquidity both today and into the distant future. And because governments ultimately exert control over central banks, they can exert immense pressure to purchase government bonds, allowing for ever-increasing government spending without the politically unpopular act of raising taxes. This inflationary spending inevitably inflates the local money supply, putting downward pressure on its value compared to international currencies. As the local currency devalues, citizens naturally seek to exchange their local money for harder foreign currencies or more valuable foreign goods, forcing the central bank to deplete its international reserves, thereby compromising its ability to facilitate international trade.
And the consequence?
Well, the consequence. Governments often retaliate with protectionist measures like trade barriers, tariffs, and export subsidies. Our source argues these were major drivers of the protectionist policies in the 1930s, exacerbating the Great Depression and fueling a dangerous rise in nationalism.
Wow, and the implications for the developing world are particularly grim, according to the source. It highlights how these policies actively restrict capital accumulation, hinder international trade, and stifle technological advancement in these nations. The global monetary system, centralized around government monopolies, central banks, effectively places the entirety of local capital markets, as well as crucial imports and exports, under stringent government control. It's a mechanism that has, as the source starkly states, continuously compromised these countries' development by enabling local and foreign governments to expropriate the wealth produced by their people. It transforms money from a tool of prosperity into a tool of political control and extraction.
This prompts a critical question for us to consider. When governments gain the ability to simply conjure money from thin air to finance their operations, as the source puts it, it cultivates a deep-seated dependency. This dependency, in turn, serves to perpetually reinforce their power, often at the direct expense of genuine economic growth and individual liberty. The very design of the system encourages central planning and actively works against the free movement of capital and goods, the very elements that are, in fact, the true and proven drivers of prosperity. It's a profound shift in the very nature of economic power.
Okay, now let's turn our attention to the actual mining process of fiat money, which, as we've alluded to, is fundamentally different from Bitcoin's energy-intensive proof of work. In the fiat system, the act of lending is, in essence, the creation of new fiat tokens. This means that everyone involved, from the financial institutions themselves to politicians and bureaucrats, possesses incredibly strong incentives to encourage more and more lending. Banks, holding those coveted lending licenses, directly profit from conjuring new money into existence at little to no cost to themselves. Meanwhile, politicians and bureaucrats find that increased lending is a politically popular way to stimulate the economy, creating a sense of prosperity that helps secure their careers and expand their influence.
What's truly fascinating here is the stark contrast between this credit expansion and the concept of true capital accumulation. In a sound money standard, like a gold standard or a Bitcoin standard, capital is accumulated by the deliberate act of deferring consumption. In other words, by saving existing resources. Fiat banking, however, simply creates new claims on existing capital, distributing them to borrowers who haven't necessarily saved. This fundamentally alters the economic game. There's no longer a strong inherent incentive for individuals or businesses to save their earnings. Instead, capital availability becomes less about earned wealth and more about political connection or access to the lending spigot. This dynamic, the source powerfully argues, leads directly into the notoriously volatile boom and bust cycles that have become a hallmark of the fiat era.
So how do these boom and bust cycles, this financial merry-go-round, actually work? The credit expansion phase fuels what the source calls malinvestment, meaning capital gets poured into projects and ventures that are, at their core, economically unprofitable or unproductive. Think of it like building a factory to produce an obsolete product. Under fiat, such ventures can appear profitable on paper for a time due to cheap credit. When the inevitable bust phase hits, these malinvestments declare bankruptcy, defaulting on their loans. As defaults cascade through the system, the money supply begins to contract, threatening the solvency of the entire financial system. And because banks hold a monopoly on vital economic functions, a banking collapse is universally perceived as a catastrophe, one that politicians and the public are willing to do almost anything to avoid.
Right, and this situation consistently triggers what the source terms the reflationary logic. When the financial system teeters on the brink, central banks are compelled to step in and inject liquidity to stave off a complete collapse. This intervention is almost always justified as a necessary measure to prevent the destruction of livelihoods, even those of perfectly solvent businesses caught in the systemic liquidity crunch. Prominent economists, such as Milton Friedman and Ben Bernanke, have built entire careers emphasizing the paramount importance of preventing monetary contraction during banking crises. Friedman, for example, famously argued that the Great Depression was primarily caused by the Federal Reserve's failure to adequately reflate the monetary system after the 1929 crash, often overlooking the initial credit expansionary policies that led to the crash in the first place.
But our source offers a particularly sharp critique of this widely accepted consensus. It forcefully argues that this prevailing view fundamentally ignores how credit inflation itself lays the groundwork for the subsequent deflationary credit collapse. And, crucially, it highlights how the very act of reflation, the central bank's intervention to print money, doesn't solve the problem, but rather directly fuels future speculative bubbles, setting the stage for the next inevitable bust. So the fiat system, in this perspective, simply trundles along, lurching from one inflationary bubble to a subsequent deflationary collapse, cycle after agonizing cycle. Each iteration, the source contends, misallocates society's precious capital into unprofitable and unproductive ventures that ultimately consume capital rather than increase it, devastating countless lives and livelihoods in the process.
What's truly fascinating here is the intricate economic and political dance at play. The inherent incentive structure within the fiat system almost guarantees these perpetual cycles of boom and bust. The source makes a compelling argument that the very solutions we implement during crises are often, paradoxically, the seeds of the next one. While these deflationary episodes are undoubtedly devastating, they also serve as a significant check on unchecked money supply growth, preventing runaway hyperinflation. As the source notes, hyperinflation is not such a common occurrence, precisely because credit creation is, to a significant extent, self-correcting. Hyperinflation tends to materialize only after severe government solvency problems lead to the literal, direct printing of vast quantities of raw paper money, bypassing the commercial banking system.
Looking at the actual data on fiat issuance, the annual growth rate of the money supply is, frankly, astonishingly high and remarkably variable. Data compiled for 167 countries from 1960 to 2015 reveals an average annual growth rate of a staggering 32%. Even in countries with the lowest growth rates, like the United States, which averaged 7.4% per year during that period, the money supply can still increase by more than 15% in a single year on occasion. This volatility and high average growth rates stand in stark contrast to gold's incredibly steady 1-2% annual growth rate, or Bitcoin's perfectly predictable and declining rate of issuance. The sheer variability and consistently higher average growth rate of fiat are clear indicators of its easy money nature and the inflationary pressures it inherently carries.
This prompts a critical question for us to ponder. If a currency is constantly and predictably devaluing, how does that fundamentally alter our perception of wealth and, more importantly, financial security? The source contends that true financial security, in the traditional sense of having stable liquid wealth that retains its purchasing power, is effectively no longer available under fiat. You are left with a stark choice. Either watch your wealth silently dissipate through inflation, or you take on debt and live with the inherent insecurity of collateral loss. Fiat, in essence, has destroyed savings as a simple, low-risk financial instrument, making expertise in arcane, complex financial markets a necessity just to maintain the value of your wealth. This implies that the correct financial strategy under fiat is to constantly take on debt to acquire hard assets that might generate future returns, thereby taxing those who save and effectively subsidizing those who borrow and hold real assets. This, the source emphasizes, is a supremely regressive impact, disproportionately harming the poor who typically hold most of their meager wealth in the very currency that is consistently devalued.
So, if fiat money seems to come with all these profound downsides and inherent instabilities, why did we ever adopt it in the first place? Our source argues that it solved a very real, tangible problem that gold, for all its virtues, struggled with. Salability, especially across vast distances, what the author calls spatial salability. Now, the source identifies two obvious uses of fiat. First, it allows governments to finance themselves with remarkable ease, essentially conjuring money for their expenditures. Second, it provides a crucial safety net for banks engaging in maturity mismatching and fractional reserve banking, shielding them from the inevitable downsides of their inherently risky practices.
But the source highlights that the third and perhaps most significant use of fiat, the one that has been most vital to its survival, is precisely its salability across space. Let's quickly clarify what we mean by salability, drawing from Menger's framework. It refers to the ease with which a good can be sold quickly and without incurring a significant discount. Think of it like trying to sell a unique niche piece of art versus selling a common dollar bill. The dollar bill is far more saleable because everyone accepts it instantly without question or discount. That's Menger's salability in action. Now, fiat, being essentially immaterial entries on ledgers, digital numbers, doesn't incur physical transfer costs. For example, moving a good delivery gold bar across the Atlantic today would cost around $3,000, which is roughly 0.5% of its $750,000 value, and it would take 2-3 days to physically transport. There's simply no physical shipment involved in moving fiat money around the globe, as it's fundamentally credit obligations, immaterial entries on balance sheets that can be transferred at the speed of light.
And this immaterial digital nature gives fiat an enormous advantage for international settlement. Systems like SWIFT and the vast network of correspondent accounts allow for significantly faster and cheaper international transfers compared to the logistical nightmare and security risks of shipping physical gold. This inherent advantage made central banks and the fiat systems they govern essential. They became the only entities that could reliably facilitate rapid, large-scale trades across vast distances and international borders when physical gold simply couldn't keep pace. The inability of gold to cross borders in significant quantities without government approval made it increasingly expensive and cumbersome for the burgeoning volume of international economic transactions, especially compared to banking networks that could simply credit accounts digitally.
This leads us to consider a pivotal point. When we look at this enhanced spatial salability, it's not just about speed and cost of transfer. It's about how it fundamentally allowed governments and banks to centralize control over the monetary system. This centralization, in turn, gave them the unprecedented ability to bail out failing financial institutions, creating what the source argues is a profound moral hazard for the entire banking industry. Historically, banks operated under a much tighter leash. Clients could demand physical gold redemption, and if a bank was short on gold, no authority could simply print gold on demand. The creation of central banks provided that crucial lender of last resort, enabling fractional reserve banking to flourish and fostering an inherently unstable system, a system explicitly underwritten by central banks and ultimately by the taxpayer. The source strongly emphasizes that the Fiat Standard and the moral hazard of a lender of last resort has served as a giant boon for the banking industry. It's a system designed to protect banks from their own excesses.
Right, a safety net for the banks, essentially. So we have a stark comparison here. Fiat money may have represented a huge step backward in terms of salability across time, its ability to retain value and purchasing power over decades, but it was undeniably a substantial leap forward in terms of salability across space, making global trade far more fluid and efficient than physical gold ever could. And this is where Bitcoin briefly enters the conversation as a fascinating point of comparison. Bitcoin, in its very design, offers a spatial salability that arguably surpasses even gold. It allows for direct, cheap, and incredibly fast international settlement without the need for credit claims or third-party intermediaries. It represents a significant increase in humanity's capacity for long-distance international settlement, handling roughly 500,000 transactions a day and completing final settlement in a matter of hours, an enormous upgrade over the limitations of gold.
That's a really important point to foreshadow.
Okay, so we've peeled back the layers of how fiat money was birthed, its core mechanics, and why it persisted. But now, our deep dive takes us into its most profound and perhaps unsettling domain: its pervasive influence on human civilization itself. Our source delves into what it calls fiat life, meticulously exploring the socioeconomic implications of this unsound money. We begin with a concept the author calls fiat against nature.
Yeah, this section powerfully argues that under a fiat monetary system, economic reward becomes increasingly divorced from genuine productivity. Instead, rewards are increasingly based on what the source terms artificial status gains and political allegiance. This effectively suspends the natural order of scarcity and struggle, where true productivity and sound economic calculation are the keys to survival and reward. Under fiat, unproductive firms, those that are politically favored or well-connected, can survive for decades, continuously wasting resources that would otherwise be efficiently allocated in a free market. It's a system that, as the source bluntly puts it, revolts against the natural order of the world by insulating inefficiency from its natural consequences.
And this profound distortion leads directly to fiat time preference. When your money is constantly losing value, as it inherently does under a fiat system due to continuous expansion, there's an overwhelming incentive for present consumption over saving for the future. Deferring consumption essentially has a negative expected value because the money you save today will buy less in the future. This inescapable reality makes people less picky about the quality of what they buy. Why would you meticulously save for a beautifully crafted, durable table or a solid, long-lasting house when your cash is effectively burning a hole in your pocket, and its purchasing power will only decline over time? This creates a strong societal preference for immediate gratification, even if it means settling for shoddy or disposable goods.
And this pervasive shift in time preference has a remarkably tangible impact, especially on what the source identifies as the longest-lived consumption good humans have buildings, giving rise to what it calls fiat architecture. It's a curious paradox that as industrial technology made construction cheaper and more efficient, the overall quality and expected lifespan of buildings worldwide actually declined. This phenomenon occurs because, as time preference rises, the future costs of maintaining, repairing, or ultimately replacing a building are discounted more heavily. For example, consider the magnificent McKim building of the Boston Public Library. Constructed between 1888 and 1895 for $2.268 million in gold-backed dollars, an equivalent of over $70 million today, it remains a structurally sound, aesthetically beautiful, and highly functional landmark over a century later. In stark contrast, the Johnson Building, a brutalist modernist structure built nearly a century later as an extension, was quickly nicknamed the Mausoleum due to its unappealing design and has required immensely costly renovations within just a few decades.
Wow, the mausoleum. That says a lot. It's not as though we somehow lost the technological know-how to build things to last, right? Our source points out that modern architecture appears cheaper in the short term, because it's true, long-term costs are merely deferred into the future through the constant cyclical need for renovation, repair, and eventually complete rebuilding. It highlights how the millennia-long tradition of classical architecture, which prioritized durability and enduring beauty, wasn't displaced because it was economically more expensive over its lifespan, but rather because its long-term value was heavily discounted in an era of rapidly rising time preference, where immediate cost savings overshadowed all else.
Exactly. And this high time preference also fuels what the source identifies as fiat capital destruction. As individuals are incentivized to save less and consume more, there's a corresponding reduction in the amount of actual saved capital available for productive investment. Credit that is not backed by genuine savings doesn't generate new capital. Instead, it misallocates existing capital into what the source terms unprofitable and unproductive ventures. Each business cycle, therefore, rather than fostering growth, actively consumes capital rather than increases it, leading to a net depletion of societal wealth. This destructive impulse extends even to natural capital. The future services derived from healthy soil, clean rivers, and vibrant forests are discounted more heavily, leading to their depletion and overuse because their long-term value isn't prioritized. The source also attributes a rise in interpersonal conflict and the degradation of societal manners and mores to this shift, as individuals become less future-oriented and more singularly focused on immediate, often short-sighted, gains.
And perhaps one of the most intimate and profound consequences of this fiat-driven high-time preference manifests in the fiat family. Starting a family, raising children, and providing for future generations is inherently a profoundly low-time preference decision, one that demands significant long-term investment, patience, and sacrifice. Sound money, which tends to appreciate in value, inherently eases this financial burden, rewarding prudence. But with fiat's loose supply and continuous price rises, the financial pressures on families escalate dramatically, leading to a massive increase in dual-income households, where both parents must work, resulting in significantly less time for raising children. Moreover, the welfare state often steps in, attempting to act as a substitute for traditional family support in old age, which the source provocatively suggests enables indefinite adolescence, reducing the incentive for young people to invest in robust family relationships or to plan seriously for their long-term future.
This prompts a truly fundamental question. If money is literally half of every economic transaction and arguably the primary vehicle for saving and long-term planning, then its distortion inevitably permeates every human decision-making process and, consequently, the very structure of society. It fosters a pervasive present orientation that, as the source powerfully argues, is deeply antithetical to our long-term flourishing and societal well-being. It fundamentally shifts incentives away from genuine production and long-term planning, instead cultivating a culture of immediate consumption and increasing dependence on centralized authorities.
Okay, you've laid out the mechanics so clearly. Now, how does this system, this spawn of marriage between government and banking, fundamentally reshape our daily lives? Starting with something as surprising as the food on our plates. Welcome to Fiat food and the industrialization of sustenance. Our source paints a fascinating and frankly disturbing picture of the post-1971 food revolution. When Nixon slammed shut the gold exchange window in 1971, it removed a crucial restraint on inflationary expansion, directly leading to the rampant inflation of the 1970s. As food prices became a pressing political issue, the U.S. government, instead of tackling its inflationary and monetary policies head-on, chose a different path. It opted to centrally plan the food market. This decision, as our source contends, had disastrous consequences for public health and agricultural integrity.
Indeed. A pivotal moment was President Nixon's appointment of Earl Butz as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, an agronomist deeply connected to agribusiness interests. This marked a significant and enduring shift in agricultural policy. What's particularly revealing in this context is how the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, the government's official measure of inflation, acts as a form of deception. The CPI systematically understates inflation by assuming that consumers will readily substitute to cheaper, lower-quality alternatives as prices rise, rather than simply paying more for the same quality. The source provides a powerful, if provocative, illustration. If your preferred ribeye steak costs $10 today, but hyperinflation causes its price to soar to $100, the CPI doesn't record a $90 price increase for you. Instead, it assumes you'll switch to a $10 chemical shitstorm that is a soy burger, as the source vividly describes it. Magically, the CPI then reports zero inflation.
Wow, so the calculation itself builds in the degradation of quality.
Exactly. This implies that if you are happy to substitute industrial waste sludge for ribeyes, you will not experience much inflation. This systemic substitution of nutrient-poor industrial products for nutritious food allowed the U.S. government to effectively downplay the true extent of dollar debasement and the resulting impact on real purchasing power.
And this systemic shift directly paved the way for the government's pervasive influence on dietary guidelines. Our source describes this as the nanny state, aggressively attempting to manage not just food production, but also public consumption. The core problem, the source argues, arises when decision-making for vital economic resources, like what food is produced or consumed, is made by non-owners, in this case, government agents. When these decisions are centralized, there's no accurate economic calculation of true costs or opportunity costs. These scientific decisions are then inevitably swayed not by pure public health concerns, but by powerful political and entrenched economic interests.
The source identifies three surprising and interwoven driving forces behind the development of government dietary guidelines. First, and perhaps most overtly, was the explicit promotion of cheap industrial food substitutes. Second, and often overlooked, was a powerful 19th century religious movement that sought to massively reduce meat consumption, most notably the Seventh-day Adventists. And third were the industrial agricultural interests themselves, continually striving to increase demand for their nutrient-light industrial sludge, as the source terms it. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, through influential figures like Ellen G. White, their prophetess, and John Kellogg, the health reformer, has been on a century-and-a-half-long crusade against meat. A key figure in this movement, Lena Cooper, a Seventh-day Adventist, notably co-founded the American Dietetics Association, or AD. The AD has profoundly shaped global nutrition understanding, leading the vast majority of people, nutritionists, and doctors worldwide to believe that animal fat is inherently harmful, while grains are universally healthy and necessary. This, the source argues, created a match made in heaven, where a messianic anti-meat message aligned perfectly with agro-industry profits and the government's overarching desire to understate inflation, making unhealthy food appear cheaper.
A match made in heaven. So with all these forces at play, what exactly are these fiat foods that have become so ubiquitous in our modern diet, and what are their profound impacts? Our source provides a chilling yet insightful list, highlighting two particularly impactful examples. First, these polyunsaturated and hydrogenated vegetable and seed oils.
Right. A century ago, healthy, nutrient-dense animal fats like butter and lard were common staples. Today, these toxic, heavily processed industrial chemicals like soybean, corn, and canola oils have aggressively replaced them, widely promoted as heart-healthy by governments, doctors, and major corporations. The source argues these are fundamentally unfit for human consumption.
And the second big one, high fructose corn syrup, or HFCS.
Yeah, HFCS. This cheap alternative largely replaced natural sugar in the U.S. due to high domestic sugar tariffs and massive corn subsidies. Despite its widespread use, the source highlights that it's metabolized in the liver in a manner akin to toxic substances, causing significant liver damage. It's why, if you've ever wondered, American candy and soft drinks often taste distinctly worse than their global counterparts. Most of the rest of the world still uses natural sugar. The source also briefly mentions other concerning examples. Soybean lecithin, described as industrial sludge waste. Skim milk, once used to fatten pigs, now promoted for humans with the same fattening result. Processed flour, stripped of nutrients. And refined sugar, which is refined into a highly addictive substance.
So the profound harvest of fiat is that these industrial products, many fundamentally not meant for our diet, are now consumed in barely believable quantities, all enabled by technology, subsidies, and relentless propaganda. This has led directly to a major health crisis. Obesity soaring since the 70s, alongside chronic diseases like diabetes and heart disease. The source argues forcefully that America's increasing obesity isn't a sign of affluence, but rather a tragic symptom of malnourishment and nutritional poverty, as people increasingly subsist on what amounts to drugs and toxic industrial crops instead of genuine nutrient-dense foods.
So what's the alternative? What constitutes sound food in this distorted landscape? Our source points us to the largely overlooked yet groundbreaking work of Weston Price, a Canadian dentist from a century ago whose magnum opus, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, remains largely ignored by mainstream dietary science. Price's meticulous research involves studying diverse traditional populations across the globe. He consistently found that all truly healthy traditional societies, without exception, relied heavily on animal products and fats. He observed no culture that subsisted exclusively on plant foods and concluded that many essential nutrients vital for human health are simply unobtainable from plants alone. The source controversially posits that the widespread messianic anti-meat message is popular precisely because it overwhelmingly benefits fiat food producers and their powerful corporate sponsors, aligning with their economic interests rather than public health.
This prompts a deeper reflection. The distortion of the price mechanism, combined with the profound lack of accountability in centralized government decision-making, leads directly to policies that prioritize industrial scale and corporate profit over genuine public health and long-term environmental sustainability. The source argues that even the very statistics we use to measure inflation are manipulated through these systemic dietary shifts, masking the true costs of a debased currency. Finally, this discussion extends to fiat soils. Our constantly depreciating fiat money, coupled with artificially low interest rates, creates powerful incentives for farmers to prioritize short-term profit maximization. This leads to practices that relentlessly deplete the soil, creating a dependency on artificial fertilizers to maintain immediate yields.
Yes, and Weston Price himself observed this pervasive soil degradation across many modern societies. In contrast, Alan Savory's work, which demonstrates how grazing animals managed appropriately can profoundly regenerate soil, represents a low-time preference approach to land management, a patient, long-term investment in natural capital compared to the high-time preference of mass crop production focused solely on immediate yields at the expense of long-term soil health.
So we've seen how our money shapes our plates. Now let's explore how it shapes our minds, our education systems, and even the very definition of scientific truth itself. It's a shocking journey into how the pursuit of knowledge can be profoundly warped by incentives under what our source terms fiat science. The core argument here is unsettling. When science is primarily funded by fiat money conjured into existence without direct accountability, it often becomes subservient to political goals, suspending genuine open inquiry and transforming scientific truth into a series of unquestionable, often dogmatic pronouncements from authority.
This dynamic, the source argues, begins alarmingly early in fiat schools. Government funding, being effectively limitless and divorced from market feedback, leads to a severe lack of accountability and efficiency. Consider the striking example of Washington, D.C. The average public school spends over $31,000 per student, while private school tuition averages around $24,000. Despite spending significantly more, like 80% as much, private school students consistently and substantially outperform public school students. This clearly indicates that the issue isn't a lack of funding, it's how that funding is utilized. Money from fiat printers has no opportunity cost in the traditional sense, leading to rampant waste and entrenched incompetence because the producers of this education aren't genuinely accountable to the beneficiaries, the students, and their parents.
And the problem only expands at the higher education level, metastasizing into fiat universities. Our source contends that the pervasive reliance on government funding through massive research grants and heavily subsidized, often non-dischargeable student loans has fundamentally warped the university system. It provocatively describes universities as having become make-work welfare programs, credential mills that churn out degrees rather than genuine skills, debt traps for unsuspecting students, indoctrination camps promoting particular ideologies, and ultimately country club experiences that prioritize lifestyle over learning. The incentive structure dictates that success for these institutions and their faculty is tied to pleasing bureaucrats and political masters, not necessarily to students acquiring productive skills or generating real-world benefits. Students are saddled with massive, non-dischargeable debt, often for what amounts to a country club experience, deferring their financial independence for years, if not decades.
This naturally extends to the realm of fiat academics themselves. Academics, insulated from market forces and funded by what the source calls the world's biggest money printer, are incentivized to produce what the source bluntly terms inconsequential and irrelevant noises and politically correct platitudes rather than robust, impactful scholarship. Their work largely bypasses the crucible of market testing. Furthermore, academic journals, as the source reveals, exploit what it calls academic slave labor, where scholars write, edit, and peer review for free, only for these same journals to then sell that content back to universities at exorbitant prices, creating a predatory economic model. This ecosystem fosters academic masturbation, scholarship that is utterly disconnected from the real world, prioritizing bureaucratic box-ticking and publication metrics over genuine truth or real-world usefulness.
And it's not just the humanities or social sciences that suffer. Fiat science proper, even the so-called hard sciences, are similarly compromised. Government scientific bodies acting as colossal central planning boards are, like any central planner, fundamentally unable to perform rational economic calculation. Research priorities become skewed, focusing heavily on superficial metrics like publication counts and securing further funding, rather than on the genuine pursuit of truth or tangible usefulness. The groundbreaking work of John Ioannidis, which famously suggests that the majority of scientific research findings are likely false, is cited by the source as intimately tied to this fiat-driven decoupling of scientific inquiry from real-world market reality and genuine empirical rigor.
This prompts a deeply unsettling question. When the funding for the entire production of knowledge comes from a single, centralized source with a seemingly limitless money supply, it creates an incredibly powerful incentive structure. This structure, as the source describes with unsparing clarity, leads to meaning-free nonsense, politically correct platitudes, and a severe disconnect from real-world relevance. It fundamentally alters what science is and what it strives for, and perhaps no phrase illustrates this decay better than the increasingly ubiquitous mantra, "The science says." This phrase, commonly repeated by academics, journalists, and politicians alike, suggests that science is a set of unquestionable pronouncements handed down from an infallible authority, rather than a dynamic, iterative method of open inquiry, experimentation, and constant falsification. The source argues this intellectual bait-and-switch has had truly catastrophic implications across every field of human endeavor, including, devastatingly, economics itself.
And the corruption, particularly in the realm of fiat nutrition science, is exposed in excruciating detail. The source meticulously highlights how much research touting meat avoidance relies on poor statistical techniques. These are often observational studies, comparing groups like Seventh-day Adventists to the general population without adequately controlling for crucial confounding factors such as smoking, alcohol consumption, overall affluence, or the strong community ties often found in religious groups. Furthermore, these studies heavily rely on notoriously inaccurate self-reporting, where people often report what they wish they ate rather than what they actually consumed, leading to biased data.
The source goes even further, highlighting what it boldly describes as the criminality of figures like Ansel keys. Key's infamous 7-country study, which claimed to prove a correlation between heart disease and meat consumption, is shown to have manipulated data by deliberately excluding countries like France and 15 other nations whose dietary patterns would have directly contradicted his predetermined hypothesis. His methodology even included margarine toxic industrial waste, as the source provocatively labels it, as part of healthy fat consumption, effectively attributing the harms of industrial oils to healthy animal fats. Perhaps most damning is the revelation of Harvard's deeply unsettling complicity. In 1965, the Sugar Research Foundation paid Harvard researchers $6,500, an equivalent of $49,000 today, specifically to debunk the anti-sugar studies and strategically shift the blame for heart disease to saturated fat. Harvard, as a government-subsidized institution, played a key role in this narrative, systematically demonizing animal fat while glorifying carbohydrates.
The devastating outcome of this scientific distortion. Carbohydrates were glorified and essential animal fat demonized, leading to widespread dietary confusion. Our source argues that modern obesity stems not from affluence, but from profound nutrient deprivation, as populations are steered towards unhealthy, subsidized fiat foods. This overall system, where fiat money enables a creeping totalitarianism, allows the government to increasingly dictate diets and influence public health, effectively captured by powerful agro-industrial interests. This environment also creates what the source calls fiat hysteria. Academics are incentivized to overemphasize risks and potential catastrophes in their research to attract funding, with virtually no professional consequences for being consistently wrong. It's why, the source claims, many modern researchers resemble Chicken little more than scholars, constantly prognosticating doom to ensure continued funding and relevance.
That's a very strong claim from the source material.
It is, and it leads us right into the final area for this part of our deep dive: how money impacts our energy choices, our progress, and the panic that can be manufactured around it. We're diving into fiat fuels, the government's energy war. Our source argues that governments, emboldened and empowered by seemingly limitless fiat money, have consistently attempted to centrally plan energy sources, promoting what it calls fiat fuels, like synfuels, photovoltaics, and biofuels, over genuine market-driven energy choices. This, the source states with conviction, wars against the fundamental laws of thermodynamics and basic engineering principles.
Indeed. Human progress throughout history, the source meticulously details, has been profoundly driven by our ability to harness hydrocarbons' awesome power, which translates directly to accessing high quantities of energy per unit of time, what we call power. But the source contends that fiat policies have, startlingly, reversed this enormous leap forward. In fact, per capita energy consumption has been declining in many developed nations since the 1970s, a period coinciding with the rise of these government-mandated energy policies. A striking example is aviation. Commercial airplanes today actually travel slower than they did in the 1970s. Supersonic commercial flight is effectively no longer available for civilians, and the world speed record for flight itself hasn't been challenged since 1976. This widespread period of stalled or even regressed progress, the source argues, aligns perfectly with the rise of government mandates and subsidies for these fiat fuels.
The conventional narrative often traces the origin of this energy war back to the energy crisis of the 1970s. However, our source provides a crucial clarification. It was, in reality, fundamentally an inflation crisis, a direct consequence of Nixon closing the gold window and the subsequent monetary debasement. This monetary crisis, nonetheless, led directly to government mandates and subsidies for these fiat fuels, many of which, like various synfuels and early photovoltaic projects, either failed commercially or were severely hampered by overbearing regulation and lack of true economic viability.
By the 1990s, as the source explains, the fledgling fiat fuel industry found fresh winds for its sales. How? By skillfully marketing themselves as the salvation from climate catastrophe. This, the source argues, represents a powerful confluence of interests where alternative energy industries, which are often economically unviable without external support, directly benefit from widespread narratives that demand the rapid replacement of traditional hydrocarbons. These narratives, in turn, justify ever-increasing government subsidies and mandates for their less efficient, often more expensive energy sources.
And this brings us to a stark, often provocative critique of what the source calls climate hysteria. It argues that fiat science is optimized for panicking. Why? Because public funding for scientific research, particularly in climate studies, is demonstrably more likely to be granted to researchers who identify potential catastrophes and highlight urgent risks, rather than those who arrive at more reassuring or nuanced conclusions. This incentive structure, the source claims, has led to a monomaniac cult that pathologically attributes virtually every natural phenomenon, from localized weather events to broader ecological changes, to CO2. While the fundamental greenhouse effect is demonstrable in controlled laboratory settings, the source contends that Fiat scientists have failed to demonstrate a significant, verifiable, real-world CO2 impact that transcends natural variations. Instrumental temperature records, it points out, show little upward trend when viewed over longer historical periods, largely remaining within normal historical variation, and the infamous hockey stick graph, which purported to show an unprecedented recent temperature spike, has, according to the source, disappeared from mainstream scientific discourse.
This compels us to consider the powerful assertion the source makes. The list of things bizarrely blamed on CO2 is, in its unsparing critique, pathologically delusional. The source offers a sobering litany of examples, attributing things as diverse as depression in pets, earthquakes, the rise of ISIS, traffic jams, earlier squirrel reproduction, polar bear aggression, floods, sea level rise, and hurricanes to CO2. This pattern of blaming CO2 for almost everything, the source argues, bears an unsettling resemblance to ancient witch doctors blaming every misfortune on malevolent spirits, diverting attention from real causes and effective solutions.
And the lockdown experiment of 2020, though unintended, offered a truly sobering real-world test of these claims. Even with billions of people locked down in their homes, cars parked, and global aviation grinding to a near halt, a massive reduction in human activity, there was, according to the source, no discernible impact on the trend in CO2 atmospheric concentration growth or on global temperature or rainfall. If such a drastic, unprecedented global shutdown had no detectable effect on these metrics, the source concludes, then there's no good reason to believe any of the dire predictions currently being made by climatologists based on human CO2 emissions.
Moreover, the source points to emerging sober voices from within the scientific and environmental communities themselves, such as physicist Stephen Kunin's Unsettled and environmental activist Michael Schellenberger's Apocalypse Never. Both, despite having backgrounds largely aligned with mainstream environmental concerns, powerfully challenge the climate alarmism, presenting detailed scientific evidence that shows little support for many of the prevalent fears. This critical perspective is further reinforced by the undeniable fact that deaths from climate-related natural disasters have been declining drastically throughout the past century. This remarkable improvement, the source argues, is directly attributable to hydrocarbon fuel technology improving human flourishing and resilience, enabling us to better adapt and protect ourselves from natural events.
The economic reality of energy underpins all this. Energy itself is not inherently scarce. The sun provides vast quantities. Wind, rivers, immense hydrocarbon reserves buried beneath the earth, and nuclear fuels are all incredibly abundant. The fundamental cost isn't in the energy itself, but in the immense challenge and expense of channeling it into high power, that is, usable energy per unit of time, which is absolutely necessary for modern needs like powering cars, running factories, and maintaining our homes. Solar energy, for instance, is infinitely cheap in its raw, diffused form, but as the source points out, extremely expensive to transform into usable, high-power electricity on a consistent, reliable basis. Hence its reliance on mandates, massive subsidies, and often political coercion.
This prompts a critical question. The source meticulously details how a present-oriented monetary system impacts long-term planning, leading to a deindustrialization of societies and a reliance on energy sources that are simply not economically viable without massive, continuous subsidies. It compels you to reconsider whether our energy choices are truly driven by impartial science or by a complex, interwoven web of political and economic incentives. The economic reality is stark. Countries aggressively mandating these fiat fuels consistently see skyrocketing electricity costs. Germany, for example, saw a 51% increase between 2006 and 2018. California, a 39% increase from 2011 to 2020, and the UK, a 27% increase in the decade leading up to 2020. These dramatic rises disproportionately impact the poor, inflate prices for all goods and services, and are debilitating for energy-intensive industries, leading to a quiet but profound deindustrialization of these economies.
And the unreliability of so-called renewables is a critical, often downplayed, flaw. Their inherent intermittency, the fact that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, means that reliable backup power, almost always from hydrocarbons, is continuously needed. This makes investment in fiat fuels an added cost to the energy system, not a genuine replacement for reliable baseload power. This reliance leads to plummeting grid reliability, with real-world consequences, such as California's governor having to ask citizens to avoid high-power activities during peak demand, effectively tying human progress back to the unpredictable whims of the weather. It's a profound reversal of the energy abundance that once propelled us forward.
However, it's worth a brief mention that Bitcoin, perhaps surprisingly, presents a unique and interesting solution to some energy challenges. Its distinct ability to purchase electricity anywhere it is produced and to subsist on cheap and wasted electricity energy with low or even negative opportunity costs, such as flared natural gas or excess hydropower, offers a powerful new market incentive for energy producers globally. It's a technology that can effectively monetize and harness energy that would otherwise be lost or unused, turning what was a liability into an asset.
Right, an interesting tangent there. So wrapping up this first part of our journey, we have traveled through a century of the Fiat Standard, from its quiet, almost accidental beginnings in the midst of global conflict, to its profound and often hidden effects on every aspect of our lives. It is undeniably a system born of political compromise and immediate necessity, a functional solution to a very real problem that gold struggled with, namely gold's low spatial salability for fast global transfers. Despite all the deep-seated problems it uncovers, the author of our source material states candidly that he has acquired an appreciation of the technological improvement entailed with the use of fiat money, particularly in its ability to facilitate complex, high-volume global trade where physical gold proved cumbersome.
Yeah, and if we connect all these pieces to the bigger picture, the author highlights that the true cost of fiat isn't merely the visible price rises you see at the grocery store. It's the subtle but pervasive erosion of savings, which amounts to a continuous wealth destruction through inflation conservatively estimated by the source at an average of 10% annual global money supply increase. It's the profound distortion of economic calculation, where fundamentally losing investments can appear deceptively profitable in nominal terms, leading to capital destruction in real terms across society. It's the ever-increasing centralized power of government to arbitrarily shape the economy and dictate societal norms, influencing everything from education to diet. And perhaps most chillingly, it's the increased likelihood and devastating cost of conflict. The total wars of the 20th century are, in the author's view, no mere coincidence in the century of central banking, with governments now able to finance themselves by appropriating citizens' wealth through hidden inflation rather than direct taxation. The source also powerfully stresses the supremely regressive impact of inflation on the poor, who hold most of their meager wealth and money, which is constantly devalued to effectively reward the rich who possess the means to borrow and hold hard assets.
So as you go about your day, thinking about your next meal, admiring, or perhaps not admiring, the buildings you see around you, or even grappling with the news and scientific pronouncements you consume, consider this. How much of what you believe to be natural, inevitable, or simply the way things are in our modern world is in fact a direct and often unexamined consequence of the unique monetary system we inhabit? And if the past century has been so fundamentally shaped by the Fiat Standard, what kind of standard will you choose? And what kind of world will that choice create for the next century?
This raises an even more profound question for you, our listener. Our deep dive today reveals a world profoundly shaped by the very nature of money, a world of trade-offs and unintended consequences. If, as the source contends, the problem of Bitcoin adoption is different from the adoption of any other technology, because Bitcoin's adoption involves decisions about liquidity and cash balances, then the ultimate question for you, given all the costs, distortions, and hidden impacts of fiat, is this. What will you choose to be your sound money in a world of ever-evolving monetary technologies, and what will that choice mean for your future?